streaming.
So those are then joining this live stream. We just had discussion about awkward ethical situations that we've experienced, and I decided to take that off stream to release some sort of pressure to have those documents because we don't really want to speak about ethical mistakes in public. Usually, so this is the kind of thing that Matthew is presenting in his book, that we have these rules, we have the common rule, and this is sort of what the IRB in US is checking. And he's saying that we should move back into these kind of ethical frameworks and how they actually guide us about the principles of how we are doing studies. So there are some principles that we sort of can all agree that are good and should be followed. Like we should have respect towards the persons who are participating in our research and have those kind of things happening. So basically, more or less, this means that if someone, for example, says that they want to be out of the study, you should allow them to be out of the study kind of things. Just understand what they want, what they need. Actually, like, truly respect. They are not just data points, they are human beings, kind of thing. Then there's the respect for law and public interest. This is an interesting case because law and public interest might be not meeting up all times. You may need to break the law to do studies on public interest, or you need to. So let's take an example that Matthew is using in the book, which is studying web giants. So they have their own terms of services, which says that you are not allowed to do particular kind of things. So you are not allowed to, for example, scrape Google. But there might be research in the public interest. Let's say that we want to study algorithmic bias of these news organizations, or Google, or Facebook. And that might mean that you need to circumvent their technical limitations and do something that they say that you should absolutely not do. So this is some of the problems that emerge in this kind of approaches that ethical questions are hard. They are not easy to answer. So you might need to break the law or break terms of services to do something that's really in public interest. And if you do that kind of research, you should really be on a solid base around that. You need to have justice, which means beneficence. And sadly, I don't actually just now, as you I just remember what Matthew was saying.
I think it was mostly about not causing harm to the participants, if I remember correctly. I read the chapter like a couple of days ago.
Yeah, I read the chapter on the bus. This is actually quite humiliating, but you can read this from the chapter. It's extremely well described in the chapters. And what's more...
It's about welfare of the participants and looking up to that.
Excellent. And could you also look at the justice?
Well, yeah.
Okay. So, you need to respect them, you need to check that their well-being is good. And then the last one we get, but what I think is more important in his overarching argument is that these principles are based on some ethical frameworks or ethical foundations. So you can have you can focus on the consequences of your research and discuss are the consequences of my research ethical. So for example, if I'm studying Facebook or I'm studying Google, which are these giant corporation things, any consequences where I show that they are not behaving like a good corporate citizens is a good. So therefore my research is ethical. That's sort of the idea of the consequentialism. And therefore I can read the principles in particular ways that support my argument. Or then you can work from the deontology framework, which is that, okay, every step of the research needs to be ethical. So it's not what ends up being the findings or what ends up being the final goal, and if that's ethical, but more that, okay, does your research process follow different steps of these kind of things? And I agree with him that speaking with these kind of perspectives helps, because these are no longer rules. These are more fundamental beliefs of what's correct in the society and what's correct in our research. And once we get into this, it's easier to discuss actually quite often than, let's say that we have a rule that you cannot break the terms of services, or that you can break the terms of services. So some rule in here saying something explicit. Yeah.
You want me to summarize benefits and justice?
Please do.
On the basis of bit by bits. Beneficence is about understanding and improving what's called here the risk-benefit profile of your study. That is, you need to analyze whether the risks involved in your research and the benefits caused by your research strike an appropriate balance. And then, in order to do that, there's such a thing as risk-benefit analysis, which will provide you with information about the risk-benefit profile of your studies, and then you would have to balance the trade-off of doing risky research, which might lead to benefits that are great enough to justify those risks. And then justice is about making sure that the risks and benefits of your research are distributed fairly in the part of the world that you are studying, so that it doesn't, for example, unnecessarily cause a high amount of risks on some particular group of people that are not benefiting from the study.
But yes, I think that something that he really advocates, and I can agree, is that we move away from this kind of rule-based approach into more of these fundamental approaches. We can discuss some things, not like, am I allowed to break the terms of services of Google or not? That's a debate that's ongoing, and people have different opinions. But you can say that, okay, from this kind of perspective, that you want to focus on the consequences of the research. Usually the cost-benefit analysis, for example, of studying some Google services is that, let's say that you send 10,000 requests to Google. That's nothing for them, so there's actually not that much harm caused towards Google, so your consequences can be really good. But then if you take more of this kind of every step of your research needs to follow ethical principles, then breaking some laws is bad, and therefore your research might be unethical. And something that he hints throughout the book or throughout the chapter is that once you figure out these aspects, you can show that they break. So consequences breaks up. You can create a weird example where justifying everything through the cause motivates any kind of really weird research. Really good example, for example, is well, there's this kind of new model of giving out funds to, is it called AI? Well, there's people who really believe that we should put all our funds into AI research, and they have consequentialism approach, which is that there's a tiny chance that AI systems become super powerful and will kill all of us. So therefore, because that's a chance that might happen, and because it has a huge benefit or risk, we should put all our research money into that. This is sort of motivation for some of the AI research, is that, okay, we believe that there's tiny probability that this happens, but if this happens, it's going to be huge, and they are more approaching the whole motivation of the research from the consequentialism, that, okay, this has really good approaching there, but if you follow it up from some other normative perspective, it might not work that well. And this is really good. And I like the fact that this, as I said, it brings some of the US thinking closer to European thinking about ethics. Then the challenge, which I agree, like many of you said, that it's really nice to have this kind of external body to say what's okay, what's not okay, because otherwise you have a huge burden in your thing. So that's sort of asking for rules. And what you should be aware is that there are different rules in different communities around this kind of issue. So here are, for example, there's a thing called Association for Internet Research, and they've updated their ethical rules, and they are just now going a third update because they figure out that the ethical research guideline is not good enough for big data research. So I think that they started the update 2 years ago, so in 3 years the ethical guideline was too old for modern day research. But this is one of those places that sort of tries to speak about these issues, try to say that, okay, this is what's happening, this is what's not happening. Then something else is that there's research institutes like the Data and Society Institute in New York, and they've created their own ethical helping tools to do this kind of thing. And there's also something called the ACM, so American Computer Science people. They also have their own ethical rules. So this is one problem with this kind of rule-based ethics, is that different communities have a bit different ethical standards on what you actually can do, how you should approach that. And for a multidisciplinary field like computational social science, it might be difficult, but why I'm bringing this up is that once you are doing your ethical discussions or trying to figure out if something is ethical, it might be helpful to look some of these. And these are not the only resources, these are the resources that popped into my mind when I was thinking that, okay, what should I show this? But there are people who've been thinking these kind of ethical issues for over 10 years in the Association of Internet Research, for example. They have people who've been really thinking about this. And it might be helpful to read some of that material while you are doing those ethical kind of decisions and planning, is this ethical, is this not ethical kind of questions, because they are hard questions, they are not easy questions. And even if we have these guiding principles and the ethical frameworks, these are still difficult. Mainly because we don't always foresee what happens in the research project, as you saw from the example that I shared with you guys. It's really hard to say what happens. So this is the bits that I wanted to have about ethics. Shortly, which is saying that ethics is difficult. I really like the more ethical framework approach because it helps us maybe to discuss some of the hard questions and sort of pinpoint those. We focus only on the rules, then there are always challenges with the rules. One of them is that they really easily get outdated because technology changes and stuff like that. But also, it really does not follow up with all the ethical complications that are in real life and you just are looking for a checkbox. Then, I think that I couldn't have this kind of lecture without having anything about the GDPR. So that's for non-Europeans, that's the General Data Processing Regulations, I think, or GDPR, and it came in effective on May 25th or 26th, I think, May 26th would be my guess. And most of you most likely have seen that in these kind of emails that have popped into your email box about we are updating our privacy policy. And the thing is, and we are actually going to skip, no, let's look one video about this. How do I do that? No, I don't. We shall skip the video. So what the regulation says is that there's tons of stuff that's now something as you, citizens, are able to ask from those who are owning and processing your data. One of them is that you should be able to get information about what the heck they are doing with your data. You should be able to get yourself erased, change the data in there, restrict that, get your data out of that, etc. And this is something that in the business world has been challenging quite a lot lately. Mainly because the law is somewhat unclear what this all actually means. So we are sort of waiting for the first court decisions, which are emerging maybe in 3 years or so, to understand what the heck this actually means. But this has changed a lot about how they want to do privacy things. So for example, quite many services now ask cookie permissions for different kind of cookies. So you need to accept cookies from advertisements separately from cookies from the what the service needs to be integrated, the social plugins, etc. And that's because they need to provide information about the processing of your data and also object that kind of data. So that's sort of the principles behind that. And the question is that does this have research implications? Yes and no. So the legal text looks something like that. It's extremely long. I don't recommend you to read that. But what's important and what's not usually in the discussion that we are experiencing of GDPR, because that's driven by the business people, is that there's research mentioned 47 times in the regulations. And what that means is that as a researcher, you don't need to follow all, and this is, let's go back there, and then I say, I'm not a lawyer. Everything that I say might be wrong, but to my best knowledge, it's right. I would check with your own university legal department, if you are doing something related to personal information, that you follow the best practices and understanding of GDPR at any given time. But if they are saying that you need to follow all of these, you can ask that weren't there research exceptions? Because if you are doing research for public interest, that's the general rule. So if you are in a university, more or less, you don't always need to get consent to process people's data. And that's huge, because that's one of the huge principles in GDPR, is that you need to always have consent for processing personal data of people. As researchers, not always. I think that the case is that if you get it from someone else, so let's say that you are collecting data, and this is my understanding of this. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I haven't gone to court with this case. It might be wrong. But my understanding of what this means is that if you are collecting Twitter data, you don't need consent from everyone in the Twitter doing that, because you are doing research in public interest. Similarly, if someone comes and says, let's say that you have a panel data, and someone says that I would want to be removed from the panel data, you don't maybe need to do that, because you have a research exception saying that you might not need to be remove people's data if that causes extreme harm, I think, for the researcher. It's framed something like this. So that's a challenge with the legal text, is that it's extremely difficultly formulated, and it's unclear what extreme harm for research actually means, but there's an exception. People cannot maybe object for you processing their data if it's for the research in the general public interest. And they might not be able to restrict you from doing that research. So this is the most important thing of GDPR, is that first it's changing all the time. What it actually means, once we start to get, so I've understood that someone has already sued Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, etc. about breaking the GDPR, and we are finally getting some answers that no one has been willing to do. In quite many businesses, they've been extremely, how to say, because there's high cost if you break the GDPR, extremely high cost. So many business organizations have been extremely careful about this and try to read this in the most strictest sense. Then for universities, at least in Finland, to my understanding, universities are not being sanctioned if they break the rules. Again, at least in University of Helsinki, they are not sanctioned if they break the rules. Of course, this does not mean that you should go and break the rules, but it's a bit less stressful situation maybe, because you don't need to find 20 million euros in case that something is broken. And there are quite many ways to do research with personal data following the principles of GDPR, but not actually doing some bits that are just extremely difficult in the big data era. This is sort of my short introduction to the GDPR. Why it's so short is that we've had the law for less than 1 month, so we are really unsure of what all of this means. The universities are going through these processes, and I'm just waiting that I actually hear some updates about some personal data that we are storing, that should we remove it all, or what can we do with that no one has come to tell me about this kind of things. Do you have any questions about the ethics or about the GDPR intro? Super short intro. Excellent, so I think that we should stop for today. So let's continue here in 5:30, is that? Yeah, 5:30, so in about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And we have lunch, no, dinner now.